All right, thank you very much, Trix, for that. Joining me in studio right now is Ashley Mazuri, my colleague, to talk to us more about this day. Thank you very much, Ashley.
Happy World Press Freedom Day.
You too, you too. Are you free to express yourself in the newsroom?
I hope so. I think so. I am.
Yeah.
We just had Trix's story, and of course there was that information that in just 16 months in India there has been 54 attacks on journalists, which is quite sad, and things need to be done about this. But anyway, let's go straight into this. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists website, 1,236 journalists were killed since 1992. 452 journalists were forced into exile since 2010. And of course, according to our 2016 prison census, 259 journalists were jailed worldwide. We'll go to the second board.
That's quite a number of
yeah, it is.
people, 259 jailed
That
worldwide.
is a lot.
Yeah.
So what does this mean? What does this say? Are the government doing enough to protect us journalists? You know, we need to be free to express whatever it needs to be expressed.
Right.
But anyway, the 5 deadliest countries, Iraq has around 179 journalists being affected around yearly, every yearly, while Syria, of course, you know what's been happening in Syria, and there's 108 journalists being affected. In Philippines, 78 journalists are being affected, and of course in Somalia, 62 journalists, and Algeria, 60 journalists are being affected. Now let's come back to Kenya. You remember last year, of course, journalists staged a demonstration calling for protection against attacks in journalists. Of course, after the freelance journalist Dennis Otieno, he was a photographer, he was killed by 3 assailants, and his wife said that before they shot him, they asked for a certain picture. So what does this say? Do we need to do more? Is the government doing enough?
To protect journalists.
Exactly. Then the last board, bits covered by victims. Now, on all these victims, of course, in India, they're saying that investigative journalism is becoming the most dangerous. But worldwide, 46% of the victims cover politics, while 41% cover war, 21% cover human rights, and 20% cover corruption. Of course, around 4% cover business, and 16% cover crime. 11% cover culture, and of course 2% cover sports. So this is the information that we have right now worldwide, Betty.
Right, and you see that especially the one to do with politics stands at 46%,
exactly.
saying that, you know, when you touch, you know, certain people, you're in trouble as a journalist.
And especially being a political year, well,
nobody wants to be painted in bad light, you know. Thank you very much, Ashley Mazuri, for that.
Okay.
So we'll continue with the conversation. Joining me in studio right now, in our City Center studio, is Shitemi Hamadi. He's a journalist and blogger. Thank you very much for joining us on News Center this morning. I'd like to hear from you. Of course, we've highlighted quite a number of issues to do with the struggle that this career has. But before we get to the issues, is there really anything that you can say we can celebrate positively about press freedom, especially in the country?
Thank you for having me as well. Yes, I think there are quite some gains that we can celebrate as a country. There are gains, especially on the legal front, that we have. Looking back, especially the past 1 or 2 years, you have about 2 weeks ago when the High Court declared Section 132 of the Penal Code unconstitutional. The section did criminalize criticizing of public officers, including the president. And remember that it was blogger Robert Alai who had been sued by the president, and he took up the case. Then about 2 other months ago, you had another case where Section 194 that was criminalizing defamation was also declared unconstitutional by the High Court. That was a good thing because you have a journalist, actually, Kurgat Marindani, who was facing the case, and the Kurgat Marindani case was very unfortunate and interesting. All he did was to cover a political rally where the governor was called a land grabber of Kajiado. Not the governor called the DC a land grabber, and the DC, according to the story, started crying. But as the journalist wrote that the DC was crying, he said he was not crying, he was reading a newspaper. And that's when now he decided to take him to court. And of course, you had other bloggers as well, 2 bloggers who had also been sued by the same and it's them who took them to court. But you also have another win in the legal front, the Access to Information Act, which came into force last year. Of course, we are still waiting for the regulation for the same. But yes, I think those 3 are good wins that are progressive to press freedom in Kenya.
Interesting, and it's interesting that you mentioned there are gains, but just on the legal front. Let's now come to the challenges, really, because journalists across the world, and even as my colleague Ashley told us, that currently there are 259 journalists who are jailed worldwide. What does this say, really? You'd expect that with many countries, you know, progressing, that the media also would be on the same track, but that's not the case.
Well, it's really unfortunate, and see, the threats in Kenya especially are physical. They're not much about, say, arrests and being locked up or jailed. They're largely physical, and they take different shapes. You remember last year, Isaiah Gwengi, a journalist with The Standard, was beaten up by the GSU in Kisumu for just doing his job of following up on crimes and on dehumanizing of people around the area. You have other cases where journalists are covering political rallies, as they should, to inform the public, and police showing their brutality towards them, throwing tear gas at them, and that kind of thing. You have other cases where, like in Mombasa, a journalist called Wangeshi, in Lamu, sorry, a journalist called Wangeshi was intimidated and threatened by an MCA. The journalist had done her job, took a video of the MCA inciting people and giving it to the National Cohesion and Integration Commission. And that is a core value, and a core value in the Constitution, a core value that the journalists did believe in. It was important to help in taming hate speech, because the first, in the recent times, of course, the hate speech has been a very key thing. You'd remember that in 2005, after the referendum politics, the 3 individuals who were prosecuted for hate speech, then the current senator for Migori County, Isaiah Kapondi, and businesswoman Kaguthia, where they failed to successful prosecution is because of the evidence. At the time, it is media houses who had the evidence, and they declined to provide it to the prosecution, and the case ended there. Now here you have an opportunity where a journalist presents the video evidence that can be used to tame hate speech, and an MCA decides, no, that's not what you should do. No, I'll threaten you. Of course, you also see other cases where journalists who are covering corruption issues in areas like Meru, in Nyeri, being threatened, being beaten up actually physically. And sometimes now the other form, from the numbers you saw there, about 20% of cases being corruption related. Now also government deciding to threaten this livelihood of journalists by wanting to close the advertising that is used to sustain media houses themselves. So those are largely the various forms on the economic front, but also on the physical front that journalists face on a daily basis here in Kenya.
Right, very profound that you talk about physical abuse against journalists. And do you think that media houses in which these journalists most of the time work for actually come out to protect their journalists?
Well, I think media does its part. I think protection is twofold. You have the journalists themselves also doing an evaluation of the situation or where they are going to establish their safety. Knowing what are the limits in areas like going to political rallies. What are the limits? Where am I not supposed to go, right? But also you have the media houses themselves seeing what is it that they can do to protect the journalists, whether it's giving them protective clothing. I think that the only time I have seen being given protective clothing is when they go to cover war, like they're going to Somalia, not here locally. There's also, I think, a dearth in training journalists themselves on physical security, how to protect themselves. I think organizations like the Media Council of Kenya, Kenya Correspondents Association, are working hand in hand to provide some of these basic and critical ways in which journalists can protect themselves. Even Article 19 has been doing a bit of security. But I think what needs also to go deeper moving forward is now digital security, because you have now the ways in which people follow these journalists and even bloggers who are articulating issues affecting communities through their phones, through their social media platforms. So how can they actually also be protected digitally? But at the same time, I think there needs to be another collective effort towards following up on these cases where journalists have been threatened, have been beaten up. When Gwengi was beaten up, you had the Media Council of Kenya, even Editors Guild coming out to condemn, and even Media Owners Association. They held a joint press conference and also asked the IG to investigate the case. But once that is done, what next? How do you ensure that these cases do not come up? How do you even follow up on the existing cases? And always keep the public updated about what has been the aftermath of these follow-ups. I think that's the other thing that is lacking in the media, both internally within media houses themselves and also by the stakeholders around media.
Important is it to have a practically free press rather than a cosmetic one, because there are two ways to look at it. There could be a cosmetic idea of what freedom of the press is, and then there's the other part which is supposed to be practical, that indeed if journalists go out there and cover stories, do investigative series, that their lives will not be in danger, they will not face the physical abuse that you're talking about. How important is it for a country like Kenya that is developing?
It's very important to underscore the role of the press, especially looking at it as a fourth estate in a country. For a country to grow, we have, what is more important is actually, as you're saying, the practical aspects of press freedom. The practical aspect of press freedom go into beyond things of physical harm or physical threats that people may harm you or may direct towards you, into even how to improve on your sources. You know, you have someone who threatens you with lawsuits because you covered a story that was sensitive. But how have you rigorously done your sourcing of the contents that you put into a story to back up every detail that you provide, so that if anyone wants to threaten you with a lawsuit, then you are well prepared and you even either threaten them back, you know, or provide them all the basics. And this is important because you'd remember I think a month ago, when former Prime Minister Raila Odinga did threaten the Standard newspaper and also the journalist Nzau Musau about the story he had covered on the daughter. What they forgot is that it is them who were the sources of the stories, right? And they thought that they could easily intimidate a journalist who did their job. And what did Nzau Musau do? Provide them all the evidence, give them all the sources of the news, that the story that they covered, and tell them, by the way, if you don't back off, if you don't live up to your word, then I'll also sue you. And they went off. They went mute to this day. So how do we robustly even improve our own sourcing individually as journalists to ensure that whatever work we do, we are beyond what are the limitations or are the expectations of the press from an academic perspective, and that is balancing of the stories and the like. But also, how do we also practically increase our advocacy? Unfortunately, in this country, we have seen the only points when journalists come together is when they are threatened their livelihoods, when either an advertising is being threatened here, or when some law that is very punitive to their growth is also being threatened in one way or the other. Remember last year there was the Kenya Film and Stage Plays Bill by Ezekiel Mutua that also, while at the start journalists were for Mutua because the way they felt of how the people in the film industry were advocating against it, they later realized that they'll also be threatened by it, including their own livelihoods. But how do we be progressive but also proactive in ensuring that the things that guard us, the things that ensure that we, in our field where we are, we can be protected, but also we do a job without fear. It's important, as people in law say, that the law works, but it's also seen to be working. So how do we, as journalists, also practically work, but also seen to be working in not only a free press area, but we actually take advantage of the same. Something, for instance, investigative journalism here in Kenya is a bit weak.
Okay.
A week in terms of, yes.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I have to cut you short. We've run out of time, Shitemi, but thank you so much for your insights into this conversation today as we mark World Press Freedom Day. He is Shitemi Hamadi, who's a blogger and